listening to Reckless Creatives, a Pipeline Artists original podcast, where Sadie Dean and Jeanne Veillette Bowerman share the candid truth about the challenges and benefits of living life as artists.
Hey, my Reckless peeps. I cannot say, hey, Sadie Dean, because she's not with me today. But I wanted to do a quick podcast with screenwriter and author Michelle Cutler. She has been a professional screenwriter for about 15 years, and she specializes in adaptations and true stories. And she also helps people with memoirs and does some coaching stuff too. But I wanted to talk to her about the process of writing a true story, whether it's a memoir or an adaptation of somebody else's work or somebody else's life or IP. And she has some really interesting insights about how to go about that and some of the intricacies involved. And also, mostly, as always, at Reckless, we like to encourage people to think bigger, step outside of their comfort zone, and maybe try something different. So maybe Michelle will inspire you today. I certainly hope so. And I know she inspired me. And Sadie Dean will be back for our next podcast. Enjoy. So, Michelle, I am so excited to talk to you today. I am slightly obsessed with educating people on memoirs because it's such a popular thing for a lot of writers to write. Like, I'll go to conferences and you'll ask the audience, how many of you are writing memoirs? And a whole bunch of hands shoot up. But also, as somebody who's had experience adapting a true story for a screenplay, both feature and limited series, there's a lot of intricacies and little special things about that process that I think writers could benefit from, screenwriters could benefit from hearing about. So I'm excited to talk to you. I think this is so fantastic.
Yeah, me too. These are two subjects that I feel passionately about in terms of their interconnectedness. And at the same time, I think a lot of people see screenwriting, or let's say even beyond screenwriting, but like adapting something into a movie or series, as separate from the whole side of actually writing and creating that material from scratch. Not everyone, most people are not both, like screenwriters and memoir writers or novelists even. So there is this sort of a division of labor in a way, but I think you're right. They're both very complementary and can learn from each other.
When you are first helping somebody think about their memoir and wrapping their brain around, what is this going to look like? What is it? Because you see people talking about like cradle to present day kind of thing, or the slice of life, like Eat, Pray, Love was just this one period of her life. So what is the kind of advice, like the main advice you give people when they're trying to wrap their brain around what exactly am I trying to cover here? What exactly am I trying to say?
A lot of times people come to me with already a sort of a specific event that happened in their lives that impacted their life in a way and changed it. And usually that's kind of like the starting point, what we would call the inciting incident. Less often am I seeing the cradle to grave, which is more like a biography.
Well, they're not dead. If they can't write it if they're dead.
Exactly. That's true. Right. So cradle to today. Obvious, of course, when you're doing life writing, you're going to dig back into parts of your life in terms of their relationship to whatever's happening now. But I think you're talking more in terms of like a framework. When you're looking at memoir, I mean, I first start with the scene. What's the scene? A scene is someone I'm about to work with right now, and she had sent me some of her material ahead of time. What she wants to write about is a very particular incident that happened in her life that changed the course of her life. And it happened when I think she was maybe a teenager. And then we're not going to write about every aspect of her life ever since then, right? It's what happened in this moment and anything that it reflected forward in her life. But we do need to look at how to contain it, right? So that it's got focus and that it's compelling you can go a lot deeper with small pieces than you can in sort of like a sweeping narrative, right? A sweeping, all-encompassing narrative. And so when we meet, our first meeting is next week. I want to first, as you say, why are you writing this now? What's the urgency, like in your life, or what's happening as zeitgeist in society right now? Something is compelling you to put this to paper. Sometimes it doesn't need to go beyond the process of writing it. Not everyone will publish anything. Like, a memoir being published is the same thing as a movie getting made. The odds are completely impossible to dictate. Like, so many different things can happen on the road to publication or the road to production. So you have to really want to spend that time living in that part of your life, and recreating it. If it's trauma, you have to really be prepared to deal with the trauma. And some people say you don't know the end of the story until you've actually lived the end of the story. But sometimes you can get there quicker because you're writing about it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And also, too, when you talked about memoirs being hard to get published, one of the reasons is, for people who might not understand why, is a lot of times if an agent is picking you up for a memoir, their next question is, well, what's the next thing you're going to write? Like, if you already wrote this memoir, how many memoirs are you going to write? Can you write fiction? Can you write other nonfiction? Can you do something else? So I think that's usually a question in an agent's mind, like what comes next? So that can sometimes be challenging. So I would recommend, if you're going to write a memoir and pitch it to an agent, already know and have ideas of what you want to write next, so that you've got something else to the what else have you got question. So in terms of, like, what do you think maybe the biggest mistake writers make with memoir?
I'm a reader for a number and an assistant editor for a number of nonfiction magazines. And so I read a lot of submissions from people who are writing mostly memoir. It's like micro memoir, like little short pieces, but they're definitely memoir. And then you start to see sort of recurring subjects because of the times we live in. So there are a lot of unfortunately, sort of bad medical experiences, bad health experiences, COVID. These types of subjects are sort of saturating right now. And editors will often say, I don't want to read your COVID piece, or I don't want to read it. I've read it. It's the same thing. And it's unfortunate to say, the same thing with Me Too, or experience sexual abuse. These types of things were happening at a certain time. There are a lot of pieces coming out about that. So there are definitely certain subjects that feel and are so important to the individual, and change their lives. A parent's dementia. I mean, there's just a lot of topics happening to a lot of people at the same time right now. Which doesn't mean that your story is not important, and it doesn't mean that your story may not change people's lives when they read it. But I think when you're writing a first draft, it should be your draft. That's your draft. Love it to death. Write whatever you want. I always say that. Write everything, whatever you want. Creative freedom is yours. When you are preparing to share it or to workshop it and develop it, then you start to think about your audience and the timing of things and how the story you're telling, again, is it just preaching to the choir, or is it adding to the conversation in a way that moves it forward? So I think it is a timing thing for sure.
Yeah, I remember somebody saying to me they had been through cancer and an unbelievable story of survival. But yet at the same time, she was like, I can't write about this. Like, there's so many cancer stories out there, like so many people, and, God bless them that they've survived and went through that. But she's like, I really don't think that I don't think my story is going to make any difference to what else people might experience and read. And so I think that's like Eat, Pray, Love, again, to bring that back, like that was different. It was like a unique kind of thing. And it's sort of the same thing with when you're going to write any book, a fiction book, or write a screenplay. that high concept, that thing that it makes it pop. The same rules kind of hold true with memoir. So that brings me to the other question I want to ask you. You're also a screenwriter. What kind of screenwriting skills do you think that you've gained that help you help people with memoir?
The memoir that I'm working on, which, by the way, it took me a long time to even accept the word memoir. I was dealing with it as narrative. I was calling it is narrative nonfiction because there's quite a bit of research involved. It's not pure memoir in the memoir voice. But people said to me, "Where are you in the story?" And that's when I realized I needed to start thinking about it as a memoir so that I was related to it. And as you know, like in screenwriting, you don't put yourself on the page. Like we're trained to keep ourselves off the page. And that was a very hard transition for me. I actually wrote a blog about it in Brevity magazine, which is a literary nonfiction magazine. Transitioning from screenwriter to memoir prose writer, I was great at writing action, description, dialogue, but I couldn't find myself on the page. And that took a couple of years of pretty intense writing work. But what I did do, oddly, because my go-to is screenwriting, the story that I felt I needed to write to get out of me, I wrote first as a screenplay because that was my tool. That's my first tool is screenwriting. So I wrote a screenplay and I've kind of reverse adapted it into the book.
Yeah.
Because the screen, right. And so what you can learn from that, like, to your question earlier, everyone should write their story no matter what. When you're talking about marketing your story, that's becomes business, right? It's the same thing with screenwriting, memoir, fiction, science fiction, what's already happening in the market, but you should always write your story. But with this, I've taken screenwriting as a way to kind of organize, almost test the narrative drive of my book, right? So and it was a good experience, it was a good experience, a good experiment. And so when I talk to people, I try and look for those things that we look for in a screenplay, not to impose it, but to understand that there are narrative components that we sort of naturally respond to, like stakes. Like, what are the stakes? Just sort of the simple questions we ask when writing a screenplay. What are the stakes? What's the inciting incident? Who is your narrator at the opening, and who do they become? Right. And these are all things, if you look on blogs, there's excellent blogs, and we'll put links about memoir writing and first person narratives where you don't ignore those things either. What's the change in the character? You are the character. You are the protagonist, basically, or I should better say, I am the protagonist. And sometimes that's an uncomfortable place to be, I think, too. Like as a memoir writer, putting yourself as the protagonist can be uncomfortable.
Well, also too, because one of the biggest notes people get in screenwriting is your protagonist is boring, or you protect your protagonist too much. I mean, my God, of course you're going to want to protect yourself. Like, so, I mean, talk about, when Stephen King talks about writing with the door closed, I mean, as if no one's going to read this. You're writing about your life. I mean, you have to be so vulnerable to do this and be able to be raw and real, and someone read it and actually judge you and be okay with that. That you probably need a therapist along the way.
I mean, it's tough. There's some, private groups on Facebook of memoir writers, and a lot of what's discussed, there's a lot of great support there. A lot of what's discussed, or what comes up often, is when people read the comments in Goodreads, like the reviews of your book, or it can also be if you publish a personal essay in New York Times or Huffington Post or anywhere where they have a comment section. People always say, don't read the comments, but it's almost impossible, I think, to not read them. And there are always going to be just really awful, dare we say, haters, out there who are just really going, like you said, going to judge you for your life decisions, when really what you're reading is the book. Like, it's a literary art form. And some people, I always find it funny when people or I know other writers, when they get this awful scathing review, but the person managed to read the whole book. Like, so how bad is that book if you got to the end, right? For me, if a book is quote bad, if it's not good for me, if I'm not enjoying the book, I stop. I don't feel that obligated to read to the end. Some people
Right.
do, but I just find it, it's just, it is a tough, you have to be ready for that. And your family or whoever might be involved in your story, or people who've never heard that part of your life before, coming out story, or, a story of, often memoir is about some kind of struggle, it would seem. I mean, if you look at, like you're saying, Eat, Pray, Love, or Wild. Wild is a great example by Cheryl Strayed, because um, it's not just her hiking the Pacific Trail, it's her like exercising a demon of grief
Mm.
while, and being a woman alone on the Pacific Trail. So, um, after that, there were many memoirs that, and I see often, sort of pitches and things about, I hiked to this, or, these type of the same context, but it's not really about hiking.
Yeah.
It's not really about eating or cooking or
Right.
hawks. Like there's so
Mhm.
many great, 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 great memoirs that are sneak up on you. You
Mhm.
don't realize that that's what it is.
That's so true. And one of the things, like, I want to also ask you about that experience of screenwriters and advice you might give to screenwriters who want to try to write prose. Because I started off wanting to write the great American novel, and I got pulled into screenwriting um, in a very odd way, and did that for years. And then now I'm back to writing prose, which is what I always really wanted to do. But some people might look at that as saying I took this 10-year deviation from my dream. But actually, the skills I learned in screenwriting, I think, have made the likelihood of my success as a prose writer greater, because there's so many amazing storytelling skills that we learn as screenwriters, like making something a fast read, having to make them turn the page, like imagining somebody behind you with a remote control ready to change the station because they're bored, you know. And when I listen to books on audio, I'm listening to, okay, why are you putting all this exposition in here? Like, I don't need this. This really has nothing to do with the story. Like, this is just you trying to show me that you did all this research and you know this cool little factoid, but it really is irrelevant. And in screenwriting, we'd have to cut that out in 2 seconds because we have such a limited space. So, like, maybe if you could speak to advice and maybe encouragement to those screenwriters who maybe want to take that script like you did and adapt it into a book.
The one thing that's great about screenwriting, and again, we're talking about storytelling, but it's just a
Mhm.
particular form of storytelling. We are very good at visual description, and we're extremely economical, right? You can do so much in a few lines. And if you think about, one page is, they say one page is 1 minute of film, but you know that when you watch that 1 minute of film, you're hearing things. I mean, it's just a whole different sensorial experience. It doesn't equate to pages in a book. It doesn't work that way. And so I think you really do have to think about. I mean, you have to really let go of screen time. Basically, that's the
Mhm.
thing. It's like it works. I think the screenwriting works really well in terms of being editorial, and I don't mean on a sentence level editorial. I mean like the grand scheme of the story. Where are we entering the story? Of course, it doesn't have to be chronological. So I think for us, it's a bit easier to let go of chronology because we know how to jump time jumps. We know how time jumps work, right? There are the ability to describe how someone looks or certain characteristics are there. But when you actually get into the prose and to, again, putting yourself on the page, you really have to slow down. You just
Mhm.
really have to slow down. I was in the first workshop I was ever in as a creative writer. I mean, as a like prose creative nonfiction writer mentor who was teaching it, who's a very good author, said that she loved what I'd written, but she felt like I was sort of pulling up in this really awesome car, throwing her in the passenger seat. And before she could even like put on the seatbelt and settle in, I was like already off and like, look at that and look at that. And I just was like driving
Mm.
like crazy through all these awesome scenes, right? And she was like, can you just slow down? Like, let your reader be with you. Like,
Mm.
let your reader discover things as you discovered them. It's not the same thing as show don't tell.
Mhm.
That's a part of it, but that's a little too simplistic. It's just like let's enter a scene and be there. Don't have all of the other things that a film has. You don't have that. You only have the words on the page, and you only have the reader only has what you give them, sentence for sentence, and how it builds into a scene in their imagination, right? So as screenwriters, we're writing for director, art department, actors, editors. We're writing for all of these people who are technically going to translate it on screen for the audience to sort of passively watch. And when you're reading the book, you can't be passive. Your mind is engaged. You hope. We hope
Yeah.
that's the ideal, right? So, in that way, they sort of work at odds with each other. Screenwriting, memoir writing are at odds with each other in that way on the page. That's maybe where the biggest battle is on the page.
Yeah. And I feel like screenwriting, we get drilled into our head structure and story structure and character evolution. So that kind of thing, I feel like a lot of novelists are more pantsers and they'll see where the story takes them and where the characters take them. But I think screenwriters coming to that space and that medium
Mhm.
immediately start thinking about structure and character development. And so we get right down to it, like this is,
Mhm.
but I love your analogy about that super fast car. Like I wrote a practice novel, that no one will probably ever see, but it was like just to see, like, can I do this? Like, am I capable of writing this kind of prose? It was the most liberating experience as a writer ever. I could get in people's heads. I could describe a scene more beautifully than I could in a screenplay. I
Mhm.
loved that aspect of it. Like when you first realized how liberating it was, like, didn't you want to just scream it from the rooftops and take every screenwriter you know and say, what the hell are you doing? Write a book, write a book.
I mean, I completely applaud you for doing that. That is a huge, just writing anything is hard. Writing a novel is not easy by any stretch, whether you want to call it your throwaway or whatever. I mean, that is just already a huge achievement in your process. To be honest, I found it a bit overwhelming at first because,
Mhm.
again, I wasn't writing a novel. I was writing I was writing a story about something that happened in my family. And I was in the process of working out how I felt about it. So it wasn't liberating in that way. However, on the page and the language I could use definitely was. And I felt way more connected to it, and it was much more experiential in that I could include, like you're saying, sort of like footnotes or anecdotes or things that would most definitely be cut. I mean, as screenwriters, we also think like editors, right? We're aware of how a scene can just be cut and left on the floor. A whole entire scene that we spent so much time can just be cut immediately and gone, right? Or it can just be moved to the front. I mean, these are things that we as screenwriters or editors, filmmakers, begin to understand that the modality of a scene, right? And when you've written it in a book, a novel or a memoir, it's much harder to do that because everything that comes afterwards is dependent upon that.
Mhm.
So, like, while I agree with you, the liberation is definitely in language and getting into subtext and inside someone's head, changing points of view, these things. I think the structure part is kind of scary that you like you said, if the pantser, it's very hard to undo what you've done. And as screenwriters, we can actually sort of like plot out a book, and then write creatively into each little corner in a way,
Mm,
so that you know that, like the way I write a screenplay is I have this board here, over here, this big cork board, and I have right now about like 100 cards up on the board, and I start to write the screenplay into the cards with a pencil. Like I stand in front of it and I start to imagine, like, I know this scene would be around here, and I know this is here, and I'm still working on the ending. We know that in the third act, if it's not wrapping up, something's wrong in the first act. Like I do all that work on a board.
mhm,
And that means that when I go in, open up Final Draft and I'm writing, I can write like a pantser in a way, because all I have to
mhm,
do is look up and go, oh, right, I got to get to there at some point. So I'm trying to take that into the writing the memoir, into the book I'm writing, because I want you to be as immersed in the story on the page as I am envisioning it. Right. When it's a screenplay, we know it's going to get turned in. Well, we hope it's going to get turned into something that people are watching and hearing and experiencing. But on the book side, like I said before, like we're really dependent on the reader to get it, to
mhm.
get it, and to want to move forward, right, and to want to move on.
So I want to touch on like true stories. One aspect of when you've written a memoir, and or even if you're writing something for the screen that's based on a true story, or whether it's a news story you've seen or real life people you know and you've gotten the life rights or whatever. What about tips for the writer to handle when the people that they've written about might be really pissed off when they read what you wrote? How they could maybe wrap their brain around that? Because just like you don't want to protect your protagonist, you don't want to protect these characters because you want to tell the most compelling, authentic story that you can tell. But you also, I'm assuming, don't want to ruin someone's life and reputation and potentially get sued. Like, like what are some of the tips you give authors, and even yourself about how to gracefully handle that you're going to be writing about people who might still be alive?
First, live in the world of your story that you want to tell, because even if it doesn't get published, even if no one reads it, even if it just becomes a piece you workshop or you write poems from, or you come up with another story idea, you don't want to edit yourself. Like the whole world is out there to edit you or to censor you in one way or another at any given time. And you own this time with your story, and you are the chief. And so before you start making calls and checking on people, first get the story out there and see how important that person is. Now, of
Mm,
course, if there are people that actually you signed some agreement, a boss or somebody you signed an agreement with, or a firm or company. I know people this has happened to, like journalists who signed, NDA agreements, that they may be able to share their story with me when we're working on it, but that aspect of the story, a lawsuit or defamation that actually happened in the past, cannot be brought in
mhm,
to the story because of for legal reasons. It's very important if you're dealing with people who aren't your people, that not your family, people that aren't your personal relationships, but actual public figures or historical figures. It's extremely important to find out about the rights to their anything, to their name, to their legacy, to anything. Like, I mean, this is a bit of an aside, but I was just reading a review about this documentary that's just been made about Prince and his creative process, but also like his mental health, psychological health, and the way he created music, right? And it's apparently the epic, most best you could ever know about Prince, and the family will not let it be released. So
mm,
it doesn't matter how brilliant that movie is, and the six people who got to see it and review it, we won't get to see it because the
right.
family shut it down, right? So the it can happen that again, there's the private side of writing memoir, the private personal side, which is actually the most important.
Mhm.
And then there's the part when you are ready to share. And then, of course, there are tips for that where there are people who say, share the portion of the book that maybe an old friend is in. Just let's say, hey, I've written this about something in college. You were there at this or something, or you were a part of this moment. Do you want to read these pages where your name is? Usually they say share something with people if it's something that you're okay to adapt a little bit, or like if they give you feedback and you're like, that's cool, I'll change that. But there's also the saying that says if you didn't want to be written about, then you should have been nicer, So you have to pick your battles, pick your battles. And also the funny thing is, so I wrote something about my aunt's death and the state of her home when she died, which is something I'm working on. And I mean, it's a bigger picture than that. And when I showed my mom what I had written, she, rather than I think everything else that was in there, she just said, "Do you have to put so many bottles of brandy in there?" Like that I implied that my aunt was an alcoholic, right? Which she was. So it's not, so it was, and she's passed away, so she's not going to sue me. And my mom knows
Right.
these things, right? But for her to have her sister,
Mhm.
she's like, does it have to be so many bottles of booze? And that's not what I thought she was going to respond to. I wrote so many
Mhm.
other things. So you just also never know what people are going to respond to. Again, you don't want to edit yourself or censor yourself. Give yourself the gift of just letting it flow, and then you deal with that later. You deal with grammar later. You deal with all of that later.
Yeah.
Grammar and life rights you can deal with later.
Yeah, I think a lot of this is very therapeutic. Like I know I've had some things happen in my life, and I always thought, oh, I'm going to write about that because that's like crazy. Like you couldn't make this stuff up. Like it's crazy and write it, but as fiction. And then I would start working on it and I'd be like, you know what? I don't want to relive that. I just don't. It might be a fascinating, fabulous story that I probably could have sold as a script, but I just don't want to relive it. So maybe if there's something traumatic that happened to you and you think you want to write it, start and then realize it's okay. Just like you said, it's okay not to finish reading a book. It's okay not to finish writing one.
Totally. Yeah. You can put it away for a while. It might come back 10 years later. Like I was saying, you have to live, quote the ending, whatever the ending is. If it's some
Mhm.
resolution, if it's some distance, if it's a better understanding, if new information comes to light and you're like, oh my God, I wasn't totally fucked over. It's because this, this happened and I didn't even know. And now I
Mhm.
can look at it, but all of this requires, curiosity, right?
Yeah.
Curiosity and the desire to know more, the desire to go deeper. All of these things, I always say the story comes first before the medium, before the style, the genre, any of these things. You could take one story and place it in 10 different genres, and it's still a valid story, right?
Mhm.
Um, for example, I don't love fantasy.
I don't know.
Right? But every so often, there's a fantasy genre or a book or a story or a movie where I'm like, oh, wow, yeah. And I realized it's because it was the story that got me. It was the story that really got me, and the the genre was just the vehicle, just the
Mhm.
sauce, the sauce on the.
Yeah. Yeah. Um, I want to also touch on adapting, like for the screen, a story that's a true story. I had told you before that I had adapted a book called Save Me by Another Name, nonfiction, and I had to figure out, first of all, where is the story because it covered 80 years of history. But one of the things that I always had so much fun with, since you're going back in time, sometimes way longer back than you can access any kind of data on, like certainly not how did these people talk and what did they say and you know specifics like that, especially in historical things. I always loved trying to figure out what these people were like putting them on a therapy couch after the fact. If John Davis did X, Y, and Z, what kind of person was he? You know, the things that he did, when his wife died, his reactions and how he handled that, like all that kind of stuff. When you look at their actual actions and the facts that you can find, and then you have to go backwards and try to figure out what was their personality like? What kind of person were they? And what evolution might they had to have made in life to be happy at the end, or tragic, or whatever. For me, adapting something that was a true historical story, that was the most fun. Also the most challenging, but the most fun, because I didn't want to accidentally or project something onto them that maybe had nothing to do with who they were. I really wanted to try to be as authentic as I could. And so I put like a little therapist hat on. Helps that I had been in therapy for many years, so I knew a lot of the tricks. Because as a screenwriter, I don't remember if have you adapted stuff like true stories for the screen? And what were some of the tricks that you did for that character evolution and crawling in their head and figuring out things they would have said?
Well, I've done 6 or 7 true story adaptations. I've had the great fortune of it being about things that were either happening during my lifetime, or the subjects are still alive. Like I was able to interview the subjects.
Oh,
So
great.
I would say, so yeah, so in every case, whether it was like a midwife in Utah, or a journalist, a woman on Wall Street at the time of the 80s, when first, or the 90s, when the first sexual harassment lawsuit was happening on Wall Street, like all of the subject, either if I've chosen the project, it's something that I feel like I can access. And access meaning there is that archival, either there's clear archival material, or the person is living and I can interview them, or it was covered in the news or covered in a certain way that I can do full research. Like I go into archives, I listen to like audio recordings, I watch C-SPAN unedited from like 1983 or something like this, or I'll watch, I'm not kidding, or like I had to watch, I was working on a basketball script, or project where basketball was at the center, and it took place in the 70s into the 80s when, or actually end of the 60s, when desegregation was happening. And I was just watching, it was so lucky that the public stations, the public broadcasting stations had like Betamax quality tapes of the entire games, like the entire commentary and the way things were spoken and the way things were said. And I could see what kind of shorts the guys wore. And I could see, I mean, it was just like, for me, that's my favorite part is the research right before getting there, like you're saying. So to actually deal with a subject that is well before my lifetime, 80 to 100 years or more, I would say, that's like trips to the library, basically. There are a lot of databases of recorded interviews, like cultural interviews with people. And again, you take everything with a bit of a grain of salt, that nothing is going to be 100% factual, the truth, but it's the truth of that moment. Like the way someone speaks about their life, a tenement worker speaking about their life in like the 1920s, recorded as an audio recording, you take us with a grain of salt, everything that's being said, because of maybe what they needed in that moment. But it's definitely giving you more, like we talked about before. I like nonfiction and creative nonfiction because everything is out, all your tools are out there, you just have to find them. I'm not the person to make shit up. I'm not that person. There are people who are so good at it, but I'm not that person. I really feel like, the truth is stranger than fiction. I guess so. But I like the journey. I like the sleuthing. I love the process. In this case, or if I'm going to take on a project, for example, either if I find a project myself that I want to adapt, or if I'm being hired for one, I always make sure that the subject matter is something that I want to get intimate with. something that I want to spend that time researching. I want to spend that time connecting the dots. I want to spend that time in these people's heads in that time, in that era. I want to learn more. I want the curiosity is there. The worst thing is to get assigned a project where you just don't care. Like, I just don't care about whatever it is. Or if it's something where you're like interviewing a serial killer to write your book and you're repulsed and every day feel awful. Some people have the mettle for that. I don't know that I would, I don't know, I doubt it. Who knows? I do like crime. I mean, I do like true crime. It's a subject I like. So maybe I would, but I would say pick subjects that you want to go to bed with, basically, because you'll spend like a year on it. So yeah, I think that's important. And of course, you want to make sure that there is existing material. Like we were pitching a project that I have with a woman in Australia, and I wrote a screenplay based on an unpublished memoir and about 15 hours of interviews with her and her father. And the screenplay won a first prize award in Australia. It's out of Australia. And we were recently talking to a documentary series producer in the United States about it. And her first question was, what's the archival material? What do you have? What are the archivals do you have? Like photos, video, because she can't even take on a project that doesn't have the existing material as a producer, right? Luckily, we have a lot of material, but I would say it goes the same for the writer. If there's no access to materials, or if it's limited, it makes your job much harder. And then at that point, you might as well write fiction based on a true story, sort of like, then you might as well, if you really feel that passionate about that story, just call it fiction. And don't try and pretend that you are nonfiction. You have a pact with your reader, you have a pact with your audience, that they understand how far off you're going, that they understand what nonfiction is in this context, that you're not deceiving your reader or your audience.
Yeah, even with, like, I'm writing historical fiction. When I read other historical fiction authors, there's some who decide to say, like, in some sort of chapter at the end where they'll say, oh, these are the things I made up, because they want to be transparent with their readers. Other historical fiction writers don't feel compelled to do so. It's all just a personal thing. But I think you're absolutely right. I think when you're doing anything that's based on a true story, anything like that, it's critical that you're honest about, can I do this? And is this really what I want to do?
Yeah, most often people put it in prologue, even memoir writers, put it in a prologue where they say, or, Tara Westover is educated, I always say at the beginning, like, this is how I remember it. And I've looked up everything that, surrounding how I remember it, but my brother remembers it differently and he was there too, and so, like, but this is my story. So you have to, set the reader up to understand the world, the rules of the world that they're in, just like in a movie. And one thing as well, when you're writing screenplays based on true stories, is that if it sells and if it goes to producer or production company, you have to supply an annotated bibliography of the screenplay. So everywhere in there that has reference to anything that was real, that happened, that's factual, that you looked up and you have supporting materials, you include that in the package. If you mention someone's name who is a real living person, you have to show where you got that information from, that it's in the public domain, right? That you're not just making something up about their character, that you actually read it in an article from the Miami Herald in 1982 in a side column, and you put it there. I mean, it's really like doing a dissertation when you just can't mess about. The legal ramifications are scary for the production company, right? For them.
Right.
For the studio. No one wants to take on a liability. If they're credible, they'll ask you to show everything in documentation to support your claims in a narrative piece of work.
So here's my tip for that. I have a huge spreadsheet of like a timeline of the French Revolution and that whole time period, whatever, because that's what I'm writing about. But in it, I have a column where it says resource. So next to everything that I have listed that actually happened, I have a link, or I write the name of the book where I got it from, everything. So
Mhm.
because in case when I'm at the writing phase and I'm writing that scene that mentions this happening, if there's something I want to go back and refresh my memory, I can go back and look at it and I can say, oh, wow, I forgot that happened there too. It's just
Mhm.
not the little quick note I wrote down in the spreadsheet. So that's why I initially did it for my own reference. But then I thought afterwards, I'm like, oh my God, I'm so glad I did this. you know? So definitely spreadsheets are your friend.
Absolutely. I've used newspaper clippings of events and things to be able to describe a scene. Like you're saying, like I had to write a wedding, for example, and it's really easy to write a generic wedding. We've seen tons in movies and we've probably been to them, and it's very easy to write a wedding. But how do you write a wedding differently? So I went and found the original clipping in this local newspaper of this wedding that got like a full page spread. And I was able to write all the details of the clothing, the flowers, what song was sung, which people were there. And that made that scene in the screenplay like so much better than if I just written, your cursory wedding scene.
Yeah.
At the same time, I wrote a scene about a parade that had been told to me, because I'm interviewing people. So I'm putting these things together I'm putting the scene together as I interview people who were there at the time. And I wrote this great opening scene about a parade. And I go to interview like the third or fourth person, and he's telling me about how cold it was and this because it had just snowed. And I was like, oh my gosh, my whole parade is like a spring day, because I didn't know, I don't know that basketball season that starts in like February or whatever it was. I didn't
Yeah.
know. I hadn't done all my homework basically.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, you can get away, with a parade in spring, but it's so much cooler to have snow and skidding tires and
Yep.
breath and to understand that in this small coal mining town of like 300 people, they've won this big thing. It just, the stakes, again, you go back to the stakes. And usually in real life, you can find stakes that are sort of unexpected,
Yeah.
compared to
Yeah.
what you sort of impose. We've all watched so many movies. We could all write a parade. We could all write a funeral. We can all write a wedding. But what makes it special to this story?
hmm So I want to just kind of wrap it up with your final advice to people who want to write a true story.
First off, is the true story yours to tell? Like, it's a point of view question. Is it your story to tell, or are you like as told to, in air quotes, they call it as told to, like someone's told you their story and you want to tell it, you want to tell their story? Or are you just completely third person watching something happen? You're the observer, right? So first, it's like, whose story is it to tell? And it's really important to make sure that that story is yours to tell. Like either it's yours because it happened to you, or it's yours, someone gave you permission, or it's yours because you are acknowledging yourself as witness. I'm a witness, right, of this situation. And then making sure again that it's something you want to spend that much time with, that you want to like really go into the cracks and dig deep under. Um, if you are a marketing type thinker, or if you're the type of person who's like, I don't want to waste a year of my life to find out that this story won't sell or something like that, then you do the research in that subject. You start with Google, like literally Google the key search words of what that story is, and see what's already out there, articles, journals, other memoirs. A lot of people self-publish. I mean, there's
Mm,
nothing wrong with self-publishing. There's a huge, huge market in self-publishing. So you don't need anyone to give you the thumbs up. You can give yourself the thumbs up if you want to do that. But see what's out there in your lane. What else is in your lane? And what are you doing that's different? what are you going to discover? You want the reader to go on the journey with you, the journey of discovery on the page. Like they're turning the page, not because you're just going to give them more information. They're turning the page because they want to see how you are going to arrive at new information, right? And what does that new information lead to next, right?
Yeah.
So I think you can test a story a bit like that, or also you just set a timer for 10 minutes and see how much you have to say about the subject. Like handwrite it, timer. Here's my story about that time that Jimmy never called me back, and then I questioned my whole sense of identity or something after that.
And even doing that same exercise for 10 minutes and writing, why do I want to tell this story? Like what touches me about this story and why do I think this is an important story to tell?
Exactly. Which, and it may change over time. Like, but you have to feel that initial sense of commitment. I think you can be speculative, but speculative only holds your attention for a very short period of time.
Well, this was wonderful, Michelle. Thank you so much for sharing all this advice.
I never like to go on with the idea of like expert or any of these things. I'm not an expert. I just feel passionate about these things. I've studied them at Cambridge University. I've spent my time in workshops. I've done my time, or I continue to do my time, and I'm always interested in this subject and furthering it and helping. I mean, the main thing for me is helping people. You have a story to tell, you want to tell it. There should be nothing to stop you. Nothing to stop you. So first you discuss what's stopping you, right? And then let's get past that, and then move into the storytelling, and then move into the mechanics of storytelling. So I accepted the word coach from my website SEO person because she said, what she's like, what you're doing is a coach. And I was like, oh gosh, really? It's like, okay, but I actually feel better about it. I love my CrossFit coach. He's helping me so much be a healthier person, think better. What's wrong with, I'm like, okay, we'll take that. So yeah, so definitely you can get in touch with me about that through my website.
Yeah. And also too, I feel like with memoir specifically, I think that's the thing that a lot of writers probably do need someone to give them some guidance because it is so personal. And whenever something is really personal, it's hard to be objective. It's hard for you to step back and look at this as just, oh, let me just look at this manuscript as if I'm reading it from a stranger. I think it's, having a coach for something like this is probably really helpful for people.
You just need to be a good listener and ask good questions and not judge. I mean, that's the main thing, is like creating a space where someone feels that they can trust you. We have so many defenses that we build up ourselves, and it just really takes them to be like, it's cool, don't worry about it. Just put it down, on paper. It's okay. Nothing bad's going to happen. It's okay.
Well, okay. So I'm Catholic. And so for Lent, try to give something up. I don't give up chocolate. I don't give up liquor. I can't do that. So I tried to give up judgment one year. Trying to give up judging people. That is really hard. I'm just
for
saying.
A whole year?
No, for the 6 weeks of Lent. It is so hard. Yeah. That was really hard. I would not recommend it.
But you could write a fabulous essay about that in time for Lent for next year and get it published.
Yeah, maybe. Who knows? You never know.
That's also what I mean. That's kind of what I do, is like I sit with someone, I listen to what they have to say. Not everything has to be a memoir. Not everything has to be a book. It could just be an essay. It could be a blog post. It's material. It's stories.
Well, actually, what I used to blog, I was writing personal stories about parenting or writing, like the personal part of it, not the craft part of it. And one of the reasons I did it was because it was an exercise in being vulnerable and being open and putting it out on the page for the world to see and to potentially shit on. But also, I always used to say, I open up my wounds and hand the reader the salt shaker. And I think sometimes writing those personal essays is such a great and valuable tool and a learning process. And so it kind of toughens your skin a little bit too, for that big project that you want to finally get out there. So I am a
I totally agree.
big fan of it.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. Yeah, definitely. Substack is a great place to do that right now. You don't have to have 1,000 subscribers. I did a year of micro memoirs. I wrote a micro memoir every week for a year. And then I had a prompt and I invited contributors to leave their 200-word little essay in the comments. And I had hundreds of them, hundreds of just
That's so cool.
Amazing. Yeah. And it's I think we're calling it rich prompts with low stakes.
Mm.
And a lot of people told me it helped them pick up writing again because they had like put way too heavily on what the product is supposed to be rather than realizing that it's just getting the story out, and then it can become anything.
You never know what your life is gonna
become a movie.
That's right. Well, thank you so much, Michelle.
My pleasure. It's such a good time to hang out with you and talk about this.
Reckless Creatives is a Pipeline Artist original podcast. Like, subscribe, and follow us on social media at Pipeline Artists. And find more info at pipelineartists.com/listen. Until next time, stay reckless.